So the United Nations has accused the U.S. of committing war crimes during the ongoing military campaign in the Caribbean, calling for investigations and prosecutions of those responsible. But between you and me, I don't think anything is changing anytime soon. I mean, overnight, the Pentagon announced another lethal strike, and the president's 60-day window to get congressional approval for these actions expires today. And there's like zero coverage of that at all. Now, if you find these videos valuable and useful, the best way to support the channel is on Patreon. The link to that is in the description below. But let's dive in to what we know. Just a couple days ago, according to the Associated Press, the UN human rights chief said that U.S. military strikes against boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific allegedly carrying illegal drugs from South America are unacceptable and must stop. In fact, we have a video from the United Nations laying that out in their own words. Here we go.
Airstrikes by the United States of America on boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific violate international human rights law. Over 60 people have reportedly been killed in a continuing series of attacks carried out by U.S. armed forces against boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific since early September, in circumstances that the UN human rights chief says find no justification in international law. These attacks and their mounting human cost are unacceptable. The United States should investigate and, if necessary, prosecute and punish individuals accused of serious crimes in accordance with the fundamental rule of law principles of due process and fair trial, for which the U.S. has long stood.
Now, this information came out the same day that we got news that President Trump had authorized strikes, military strikes, inside of Venezuela. The Miami Herald reported, quote, "The Trump administration has made the decision to attack military installations inside of Venezuela, and the strikes could come at any moment," sources with knowledge of the situation told the Miami Herald, as the U.S. prepares to initiate the next stage of its campaign against the Soles drug cartel. Sources told the Herald that the targets, which could be struck by air in a matter of days or even hours, also aimed to decapitate the cartel's hierarchy. While sources declined to say whether Maduro himself is a target, one of them said that his time is running out. Quote, "Maduro is about to find himself trapped and might soon discover that he cannot flee the country even if he decided to. What's worse for him, there is now more than one general willing to capture and hand him over, fully aware that one thing is to talk about death, another is to see it coming." Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out pretty quickly to say, quote, "Your sources claiming to have knowledge of the situation tricked you into writing a fake story." We'll see. I mean, we had this happen before. If you remember when Israel began their bombing campaign against Iran, I think it was when Israeli jets were in the air, President Trump was talking about the next stage of the negotiation. So there are deception tactics here at play, no doubt. And we did see, as this news came out, increased reports of increased GPS jamming around Venezuela. Some countries in the area heightened their military posture, and we saw some airspace closures in the area that would suggest areas that could be used for military action. So we've talked about it for quite a while on this channel. The next step in this campaign, more than just striking the occasional drug boat, or every day now at this point, is going after military targets, likely cartel targets inside of Venezuela itself. We should expect that as the next phase. Now, overnight, Secretary Hegseth announced another lethal strike, this one in the Caribbean, saying, quote, "The Department of War carried out a lethal kinetic strike on another narco-trafficking vessel operated by a designated terrorist organization in the Caribbean." And note some of the phrasing here, kind of going after allegations of a couple different sorts. He says, quote, "This vessel, like every other, was known by our intelligence to be involved in illicit narcotic smuggling, was transiting along a known narco-trafficking route, and carrying narcotics. 3 male narco-terrorists were aboard the vessel during the strike, which was conducted in international waters. All 3 terrorists were killed, and no U.S. forces were harmed in this strike." Again, to the messaging here. He says, "These narco-terrorists are bringing drugs to our shores to poison Americans at home, and they will not succeed. The department will treat them exactly how we treated Al-Qaeda. We will continue to track them, map them, hunt them, and kill them." In fact, this was a part of the conversation we had just a couple days ago with Ben Conable and Colin Clark. I'll put that link to that interview in the description below, where they talk about the perils, the risks of getting involved in a military operation in Venezuela. And one of the things they pointed out was how we've seen in recent weeks a shift. These were cartels, then they became narco-trafficking terrorist organizations. Now we're seeing more and more the comparisons to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. groups that are more familiar to the United States. We clearly associate them with really bad actors. And maybe some of the terminology being used previously wasn't getting the job done, so we're seeing a bit of a shift in that direction. Now, on that note, we have seen a shift in recent weeks towards hitting more targets in the Pacific rather than the Caribbean. Notably, last night was in the Caribbean, but prior to that, I think it was the last 4, 5, or even 6 strikes were in the Pacific. CNN has a report out saying, quote, "The Pentagon has deliberately shifted its strategy in recent weeks to striking suspected narco-traffickers in the Eastern Pacific rather than the Caribbean because administration officials believe they have stronger evidence linking cocaine transport to the U.S. from those Western routes," according to people familiar with the matter. The intelligence suggests that cocaine is far more likely to be trafficked from Colombia or Mexico rather than Venezuela. And this is something we've talked about pretty regularly when you're looking at what exactly are we trying to do here. If you eliminate every one of the boats coming from, if drugs from Venezuela to the United States drops to zero, there's still a lot of drugs coming to the United States. It's arguable whether or not that dent would even be noticed in terms of U.S. consumption of drugs. So it raises the question of what exactly are we doing with Venezuela? And the argument here is they've noticed that and they're shifting a bit to the Pacific. There was a briefing on this last week, and Democratic Representative Sarah Jacobs talked about this. I guess they pushed on fentanyl a little bit, and you'll see that argument. Hey, fentanyl is the killer, and cocaine's not good, of course, but fentanyl is the item that has led to so many overdoses in the United States recently. So it sounds like the lawmakers are pushing on that, and the response they got was that cocaine is a facilitating drug of fentanyl. Again, I don't know that there's any evidence of any fentanyl at all coming from Venezuela, let alone even a significant percentage, and certainly not the majority coming into the United States. So again, a little bit of a shift in the framing of these operations. Representative Jacobs said, quote, "None of them could say what they're doing for fentanyl. Fentanyl is the real problem here, and they're actually not addressing fentanyl in any of these operations." I'd probably try to walk a little bit of a middle ground there. Drugs are a problem, full stop. Fentanyl is arguably a bigger problem, but I don't know that we should go away from counter-narcotics operations if they're not exclusively focused on fentanyl. But again, we are seeing a bit of the change in the framing here. I mean, President Trump, in recent addresses talking about this, has talked about the amount of fentanyl coming from Venezuela. And that just doesn't line up with even recent U.S. intelligence assessments that might explain why we're seeing an uptick in the strikes in the Pacific. Now, something else that I know I'm kind of beating this drum a lot recently, I think it's important, is congressional oversight here and who gets to approve and authorize the continuation or even the initial use of military force. It sounds like this week, the head of Trump's Office of Legal Counsel, T. Elliott Gazer, told lawmakers that they can continue its lethal strikes and is not bound by decades-old laws requiring Congress to give approval for ongoing hostilities. As in, they don't need to. They're good to go. The rationale he gave, they said the officials said the administration does not believe U.S. troops are in danger in the ongoing operation, so the law did not apply. Quote, "The operation comprises precise strikes conducted largely by unmanned aerial vehicles launched from naval vessels in international waters at distances too far away for the crews of the targeted vessels to endanger American personnel." They quote Brian Finucane, a former legal advisor to the State Department, who said, quote, "What they're saying is anytime the president uses drones or standoff weapons against someone who cannot shoot back, it's not hostilities. It's a wild claim of executive authority." And again, like, our troops that are forward deployed are always at risk. Even the launching of unmanned aerial vehicles with live munitions is a risk, right? It's a far different risk than coming under direct hostile fire. But this is a pretty interesting reading of what this could actually mean. It means it doesn't take much to extrapolate this out and say, so long as we only use drones, it's not a war. So long as we only use drones, it's not active hostilities. I feel like that's not the spirit of what Congress and the Founding Fathers were getting at with all of this, right? Like, it's pretty clearly still a war and military action if we're just using drones instead of our people actively shooting or getting shot at. Now, this raises the question of the 60-day window that at one point was discussed pretty widely. I feel like in recent days it's just completely fallen off, which is interesting given that tomorrow it expires. So legally, the president, the United States, should stop military action in the Caribbean tomorrow. That's not going to happen. And it's not how this has played out for a long time. And we got a couple examples here under President Obama, President Biden. You can find probably examples of this from any president in recent history where they just blow right past these 60-day deadlines. Just Security had a roll up here where they said, quote, on September 4th, President Trump sent a letter to Congress in accordance with the War Powers Resolution to report on the September 2nd military strike on a vessel in the Caribbean, targeting and killing 11 individuals allegedly engaged in illicit drug trafficking. The statutory requirement that the executive branch cease any use of military force without congressional authorization passed Monday, when the War Powers Resolution 60-day clock runs out. They say even when a president is acting under his or her constitutional authority, the statute requires that the operations terminate after 60 days if Congress has not yet approved of the action. So that's the legal part here, is that Congress has to take action. They haven't. By and large, and I don't think this should come as a shock to anyone watching this, Congress has abdicated so many of their responsibilities in recent years. This is just another one. In fact, Just Security, I think, does a good job of making it clear, like, hey, this is not just a matter of, like, Trump. This has been the case for multiple administrations. They pointed to Libya in 2011, where we had forces there were operating there for 7 months straight. And the argument made under the Obama administration was that they were in a supporting role as part of a integrated multinational force, and that we were using air power rather than ground troops. Again, come on. Like, we're parsing words here, right? That's clearly not the spirit of the law. They talk about the most recent example was actually with the Houthis, where the Biden administration filed 4 war powers resolutions in January and February 2024, and then they just stopped. Like, that's enough. And then just kept going, which gets into another rationale that's been used where it's just kind of slicing these off one at a time, and this may have been one of the Biden arguments. They actually said that there was nothing more mentioned about that. Like, they just stopped submitting these war power authorizations and then just continued on, and there was no pushback. So there's that. Another argument that's been made is that every single incident restarts that clock. So if we applied that to the Houthis, it would be every time they launch munition at a U.S. boat, it restarts the 60-day clock. Again, probably not how this was intended to be interpreted, but we are starting to see a little bit of pushback here inside the United States from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. According to Fox News, they said a bipartisan pair of senators are calling on Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth to hand over copies of the orders issued to strike boats in the Caribbean allegedly targeting narco-terrorists. Senators Jack Reed, a Democrat of Rhode Island, and Roger Wicker, a Republican of Mississippi, released 2 letters they sent to Hegseth in recent weeks in response to the repeated strikes on suspected drug boats. They say the first letter was issued on September 23rd, explaining the legal requirements for congressional oversight over the military's executed orders, including that congressional defense committees must be provided copies of the orders within 15 days of being issued. They said, unfortunately, the department has not complied with this request. The second letter, then issued on October 6th, sought a written opinion from the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel on the domestic or international legal basis for conducting the strikes and related operations. They added, quote, drug trafficking is a terrible crime that has devastating impacts on American families and communities and should be prosecuted. Nonetheless, the president's actions to hold alleged drug traffickers accountable must still conform with the law. So today and tomorrow is a pretty big day in that regard. I don't think there's anything on the horizon that's going to prompt a stop in military operations. All indications, everything we see from the Pentagon, from the White House, from the State Department, anyone associated with this, is that the strikes are ongoing. The strikes will continue. And I would expect as these continue, we start to hear more pushback from the international community. We, of course, have heard some condemnations from countries like Colombia and Trinidad, where some of their citizens have been caught in the middle of this. In one case, clearly they were trafficking. They were in a narco submarine. There have been accusations that some citizens not affiliated with the cartels have been caught up in this as well. So we have that. We're going to likely hear more from the United Nations. I'd be surprised if this is the last time they kind of speak out on this. And we are starting to hear a little bit more from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Again, the important part here, I think, at least personally, is we don't want to slip into a war and all of a sudden we find ourselves fighting a conflict we didn't necessarily sign up for. And that was, again, kind of the focus of the conversation just a couple days ago with Colin Clark and Ben Conable, saying if we're heading in this direction, let's be very clear-eyed about what we're getting into and make sure we have a clear strategy as to what we're trying to accomplish and how. That's all we got for now. Again, if interested in supporting the channel, Patreon is the best way to do that. That's linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.